Good evening, dear viewers. It's 8 p.m. in Cairo time for our Panorama News, where we bring you the latest on the political, business, and sports segments. I'm Steli Lamloum, and I will be bringing you the political segment, but first, the headlines. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi addresses the UN Climate Summit. World leaders launch bid for climate breakthrough in their summit in Paris. And Egyptian expats start voting in the run-off round of the second phase of parliamentary election. The viewers, welcome back. Heads of state and government from 150 countries opened the biggest ever climate summit on Monday in Paris, tasked with inking a historic deal to stave off disastrous global warming. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi addressed the opening session of the summit. In his speech, the president called for reaching a just and clear agreement for facing the climate change. The president called for reaching a binding agreement on the joint responsibility between developed and developing countries to alleviate the negative effect of climate change. Here is the full speech.
The President of Egypt, to be followed by Ms. Angela Merkel.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فخامة الرئيس فرانسوا أولاند.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, His Excellency President of the French Republic, Excellencies, heads of state and government, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Mrs. Secretary General of the UNFCCC. Ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to thank His Excellency the French President for the kind invitation, hospitality, and organization of this conference. I also wish to express my condolences to the leadership and people of France for the victims of the vicious terrorist attacks in Paris, and we reiterate our strong condemnation of these attacks and the full solidarity of Egypt with France in our common fight against all kinds of terrorism. We are facing a crucial juncture in our international endeavor, as all of our peoples are watching us and hoping that this conference proves to be a turning point in achieving our common goal to secure a better future of humanity and protect the rights of the next generations by reaching an ambitious, sustainable, balanced, and international agreement to face the increasingly dangerous climate change-related challenges. A few months ago, we all participated in adopting an international ambitious developmental agenda on sustainable development and poverty eradication. The effort has been exerted in formulating this agenda, and the effort that will be exerted to implement it could fail if this agenda is not supported by an international agreement that strongly addresses climate change challenges and achieve the desired balance between economic development, social development, and environment protection. Ladies and gentlemen, Egypt has and will continue to play a constructive role in all of the climate change negotiating rounds leading to this conference in view of its responsibility to represent the African continent and defend the African interests and legitimate rights. Our position has been based on the necessity that any new international agreement should not harm the African countries' right to development or impede its efforts to eradicate poverty, especially that Africa is the least contributor to harmful emissions, yet it is the most affected continent by climate change repercussions. Therefore, it is imperative that any flexibility arrangements in the agreement should include the African countries together with the least developed countries and small island developing countries. Africa also calls for an international agreement that is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities between developed and developing countries in facing climate change challenges in accordance with the principles of the UNFCCC and to achieve balance among the various components of this agreement. Thus, it is unacceptable that we give most of our attention to mitigation without attaching equal importance to the other components of the agreement, especially those related to developing the adaptation capabilities of the developing countries, and it is also important that the agreement includes a global target on adaptation. The agreement should also be legally binding as long as it encompasses clearly defined commitments for the developed countries to provide the developing world with the adequate support in terms of financing, capacity building, and advanced technology in order to enable the African and other developing countries to adapt and transform our economies to achieve sustainable development, in addition to a clear commitment in the agreement that the increase in temperature does not exceed 1.5 degrees and to avoid shifting the burden of mitigation from the developed to the developing countries. The issues of financing, capacity building, and technology should not be viewed as merely negotiating positions, but a strong necessity and a main indicator of the seriousness of the international community to face climate change challenges. A recent report of the United Nations Environment Program indicated that Africa needs between $7 and $15 billion annually until 2020 for adaptation, and needs between $50 to $100 billion annually until 2050, and that the financing which our continent can provide would not exceed $3 billion annually, which means that there will be a financing gap not less than $12 billion annually until 2020, and will keep increasing after 220 by much higher rates. Therefore, if the agreement doesn't effectively and transparently address the financing issue, it will be borne weak and will prove to be unsustainable. It is imperative that the agreement reflects a commitment to provide $100 billion annually to the developing countries by 2020, to be doubled beyond 2020. This is the framework in which the African states took the lead by developing initiatives. The first initiative aims at promoting renewing energy. I call international community and governments, private sector and regional international organizations to lend full support to the two African initiatives which contribute to our international endeavor on addressing climate change challenges. Despite of the difficulty and severity of the challenges we are endeavoring, I'm confident that we have enough determination, wisdom, and solidarity to overcome these challenges.
And on the sidelines of the summit, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi met on Monday with French President François Hollande. The talks covered bilateral relations and means of boosting economic cooperation, as well as efforts to combat terrorism. The President also met with UN Chief Ban Ki-moon for talks on a number of regional and international issues. The talks also tackled the situation in the Middle East and efforts to restore peace and combat terrorism. El-Sisi and the UN Secretary General also discussed means of achieving sustainable development and efforts to alleviate the negative effect of climate change. Upon his arrival in Paris on Sunday, the President held a number of meetings, including a meeting with Iraqi President Fouad Ma'soum. The two leaders tackled means of enhancing bilateral relations. The Iraqi President praised Egypt's role in maintaining regional security and stability. Addressing the opening session of the UN Climate Summit, French President François Hollande said that the fights against terrorism and global warming are closely linked. He noted terrorism and global warming are two big global challenges. 2 weeks after deadly Daesh terrorist attacks in the French capital, Hollande also reiterated that any deal to try to keep any further rise in global temperatures down to 2 degrees centigrade needed to be universal, differentiated and binding, with richer countries contributing more than poor ones. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called on world leaders to accelerate action to avert a dangerous rise in temperatures. World leaders attending a climate summit in Paris observed a minute's silence on Monday for the 130 people mowed down in terrorist attacks in the French capital on November the 13th. Chinese President Xi Jinping called for rich nations to honor their commitment to provide a $100 billion a year to developing countries to tackle climate change. We have the details in the following report.
Some 150 heads of governments and states kicked off high-stakes negotiations in Paris today aimed at curbing global warming and helping poor countries cope with its impact. At the UN Climate Summit, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe lashed out at miserably developed nations, accusing them of trying to shift the burden for curbing carbon emissions onto poor countries. Mugabe said the developed nations were historically responsible for the precarious climate environment we currently live in. Also, Chinese President Xi Jinping called for rich nations to honor their commitment to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries to tackle climate change. Xi told the UN Climate Summit that developed countries should accept more shared responsibility for limiting global warming and helping poor countries to adapt to a climate-afflicted world. Researchers said that the world's 48 poorest countries will need to find around $1 trillion between 2020 and 2030 to achieve those plans to tackle climate change, and those plans should be a priority for international funding. Today, 11 donor governments pledged close to $250 million in new money for adaptation in the poorest countries at the start of the UN climate talks. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that his country is ready to cut its greenhouse emissions by almost one-third over the next 15 years compared with 1990 levels. Putin said that by 2030, Russia is ready to bring its greenhouse gas emissions to 70% over their level in 1990. U.S. President Barack Obama said the United States, as the world's second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, recognized its role in creating the problem of global warming and embraced its responsibility to help fix it. Obama said that staging the summit in the French capital was a rebuke to extremist militants who killed 130 people there on November 13th.
Egyptian expats started on Monday voting in the runoff round of the second phase of parliamentary elections. Expats vote on Monday and Tuesday in 139 embassies and consulates around the world. 426 nominees compete for 213 seats in 99 constituencies in the runoff round. Voting starts at 9 a.m. and ends at 9 p.m. according to the local time of every country. For Egyptians inside the country, the vote is to be held on Tuesday and Wednesday. The voting in the second phase takes place in 13 provinces, including the capital, Cairo. Only 9 candidates own seats in the first round from 2,847 candidates. Prime Minister Sharif Ismail held a ministerial meeting on Monday to review the implementation of the mega national projects. The meeting also covered measures to reduce the budget deficit. The Prime Minister said that the government is focusing on means to improve the standard of living for citizens and provide basic commodities in acceptable prices. He added that controlling hiking prices is a priority for the government. Arab League Secretary General Nabil Al-Arabi agreed on Monday to intensify cooperation and political consultations between the Arab League and the African Union over facing challenges in Africa and the Arab region. This came during a meeting with African Union's Commissioner for Peace and Security, Ismail Sharqi. Following the meeting with Al-Arabi, Sharqi said the meeting also focused on recent developments in the Middle East and current tensions in Africa and the Arab world. Al-Sharqi also noted that they also reached a joint vision for dealing with such crises as terrorism and security problems in Somalia, Yemen, and Libya. The German government is planning to send up to 1,200 troops to help in the fight against Daesh terrorist group. Defense Ministry spokesman said on Monday that the figure would be an upper limit for the number of troops needed to provide support for and operate reconnaissance aircraft, tanker planes, and a warship. The cabinet is due to agree the mission's mandate on Tuesday and put it to Parliament for approval. German troops won't actively engage in combat. Officials rejected any suggestion that Germany might cooperate with troops loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the fight against the militants. Relations between Moscow and Ankara have deteriorated after Turkey shot down a Russian Air Force jet during an operation near the Syria-Turkey border last week. Russian President Vladimir Putin snubbed the meeting with Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Paris on Monday, as Turkish authorities again pledged not to apologize over last Tuesday's downing of the Russian jet. We have the details in the following report.
Russian President Vladimir Putin snubbed a meeting with Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Paris today as the body of a pilot killed when Ankara downed one of the Moscow's warplanes was flown home. Turkish authorities, meanwhile, again pledged not to apologize over last Tuesday's downing of the Russian jet as Moscow rolled out its sanctions aimed at exacting economic revenge on Ankara. Putin and Erdogan have been locked in a war of words since the incident, and the Kremlin's strongman rejected the Turkish leader's offer of talks on the sidelines of the climate conference in the French capital. The downing of the Russian jet on the Turkey-Syria border, the first time a NATO member has shot down a Russian plane since 1952, has seen ties shattered between the two rival players in the Syria conflict. Russia's government to laid out more details of retaliatory economic sanctions aimed at denting Turkey's key tourism and agricultural sector. Moscow announced it will halt fruit and vegetable imports from Turkey after Putin signed a decree over the weekend banning charter flights and the sale of package holidays and scrapping Russia's visa-free regime with the country. The Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev called the moves a first step, as Moscow also said it would limit Turkish transport firms and tighten controls across Russian contracts. The authorities, however, stopped short of targeting Russia's major joint energy projects with Turkey.
Reduction of our economy, we have reduced it by 33%.
The European Union vowed on Monday to work for Middle East peace, even though Israel suspended it from the diplomatic process over the bloc's decision to label goods imported from Israeli settlements. European Commission Foreign Affairs spokeswoman said that when it comes to the Middle East peace process, the EU continues and will continue to work on this in the quartet with partners. The EU is a member of the International Quartet, along with the United States, Russia, and the United Nations, that conducts diplomacy with Israel and the Palestinians in a bid to end their decades-old conflict. Israel's foreign ministry said on Sunday that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered suspension of diplomatic contacts with the institutions of the European Union and its representatives on this issue. Pope Francis ventured into one of the world's most dangerous neighborhoods on Monday to implore Christians and Muslims to end a spiral of hate, vendetta, and bloodshed that has killed thousands over the past 3 years. We have the details.
Pope Francis said that Muslims and Christians were brothers, urging them to reject hatred and violence while visiting a mosque in the Central African Republic's capital, which has been ravaged by sectarian conflict. On the last leg of the three-nation tour of Africa, the leader of the world's 1.2 billion Catholics visited a flashpoint Muslim neighborhood in Bangu on what was the most dangerous part of his 24-hour visit. Thousands of people gathered at the roadside cheering as his Pope mobile drove down the red dirt road. After meeting Muslim leaders at the Kokondoko Mosque in the PK5 district, he said that Muslims and Christians are brothers and sisters. The Pope later flew out to Bangu at the end of his first trip to Africa that has also taken him to Kenya and Uganda. France's message of peace and reconciliation appeared to have made a powerful impression, with a group of Muslim rebels turning up to join tens of thousands watching a papal mass at the capital's Barthélemy Boganda Stadium. Several hundred people had packed into the mosque, including a number of actually living there after being forced out of their homes by the violence. Francis said the visit to Kar would not be complete if it did not include this encounter with the Muslim community, saying all those who believed in God must be men and women of peace. Despite the tight security, the visit took place in a relaxed atmosphere. The 78-year-old pontiff has hammered home a message of peace and reconciliation, ending his visit with a mass at the 20,000-seat stadium, with thousands more watching it on a giant screen set up outside.
The head of the Electoral Commission in Burkina Faso said that provincial results from an election to choose the West African country's first new leader in decades should be announced on Monday. President of the Independent National Electoral Commission told the news conference that there was strong turnout in all 45 provinces and that logistical problems at the start of the day were by and large resolved. Analysts say only 2 of the 14 candidates stand a real chance of winning and a second round is possible. France's foreign ministry said on Monday that the UN nuclear watchdog must provide all the information it possesses with the necessary detail on whether Iran has in the past carried out work related to nuclear weapons. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is due to publish a report this week on the matter, which could allay remaining concerns on Iran's intentions as part of a deal between world powers and Tehran. It could provide for a lifting of sanctions against Iran in exchange for restrictions on its nuclear program. Unknown attackers shot and killed the head of an immunization program in northwest Pakistan on Monday, the latest in a string of killings targeting people linked to a polio eradication campaign in the country. The district police official said that the doctor, the head of the expanded program of immunization in Swabi district, was driving when the gunman opened fire on his car, killing him on the spot and injuring his driver. On the other hand, the leaders of Pakistan and Afghanistan met in Paris on the sidelines of the climate change summit on Monday to discuss ways to resurrect peace talks with Taliban militants and improve relations between the neighbors that soured earlier in the year after a string of terrorist attacks in Kabul. Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Barack Obama discussed the Syrian crisis and the situation in Ukraine during a meeting on Monday on the sidelines of the climate summit in Paris. A White House official said that Obama stressed the importance of targeting Daesh terrorists in Syria and not focusing military attacks against rebel groups who oppose Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The official said that the two presidents discussed the imperative of making progress on the Vienna process to bring about a ceasefire and political resolution to the civil war in Syria. Dear viewers, and by this we wrap up our political segment for now, and now it's time for the business and economy with my colleague Hayes.